The courtroom was packed so tightly that it seemed to hum. Every seat was taken, people standing in the back against the paneled walls, the air dense with the warmth of too many bodies and the quiet static of expectation. The light from the high windows fell unevenly across the benches, catching on polished wood and the pale faces of those craning forward. It smelled faintly of varnish and old paper, with the sharper note of cologne and the faint trace of rain that clung to coats. No one spoke above a whisper. It felt less like a trial and more like the few seconds before a fight begins, when everyone knows the first blow is about to land. He sat at the table, the man everyone had come to see, as if the room had been arranged around him. Mid-40s, but with the kind of confidence that passed itself off as ageless. His suit was dark, expensively cut, the tie knotted too carefully not to be deliberate. He leaned back in his chair, one arm slung casually over the backrest, ankle resting on a knee, smiling with a mouth that looked practiced in the mirror. His cufflink flashed when he gestured, a tiny silver signal that he was here on his own terms. He let the silence stretch long enough for the room to bend toward him, then said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Seriously? This is entertainment for retirees. Judge Judy? You're nothing but a television figurehead. I saw a dozen like you in Washington every week." The words sliced through the waiting hush. For a moment, no one moved. Then, from the third row, someone let out a nervous laugh, quickly swallowed when it didn't catch on. A woman whispered, "Did he really just say that?" And her neighbor shook his head slowly, as though to steady himself. The man's smile widened, pleased with the disruption. He spread his hands as if to say, "Look, I've already won." His voice carried with ease, trained in boardrooms and gala dinners, used to commanding attention without effort. At the bench, she lifted her eyes from the papers in front of her. The movement was small, almost dismissive, but the effect was immediate. The air in the room changed direction. Her gaze was cold, measured, a light turned onto him that did not blink. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, not raised to match his volume, but every person in the room heard it with painful clarity. "You just compared me to politicians?" she said, tone even, sharp as a scalpel. "That was a mistake. I don't have voters. I have facts." The gallery shifted, as though the floor itself had tilted. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh, he's done." Another voice, almost gleeful, murmured, "This is going to get ugly." A man near the aisle drew his phone a fraction from his pocket before sliding it back, afraid of the bailiff's stare but unwilling to miss what was about to unfold. The defendant's smirk faltered, just enough to register to those watching closest. He opened his mouth as though to speak, then thought better of it, resting his hand instead on the armrest, and tapping his fingers in a rhythm that was almost too fast. His confidence had slipped, even if only for a second. The silence that followed was thicker than before, no longer anticipation but recognition. This wasn't going to be ordinary. This wasn't a skirmish. This was blood sport, carried out with paper and words instead of fists. He cleared his throat, forcing the smile back, but it no longer looked natural. The crowd leaned forward, every head tilted toward the two figures at the center. They knew instinctively what had shifted. The balance of the room was no longer his to command. The bailiff glanced around the gallery, jaw set, but even he seemed caught in the pull of it. The defendant shifted again in his chair, the silver flash of his cufflink dulled now by sweat on his wrist. She lowered her gaze back to the papers, but the damage had already been done. The words she had spoken hung in the air, heavier than the humid breath of the crowd. The man who had strutted in with the arrogance of someone untouchable had been checked in a single, measured sentence. The audience, sensing the fight had truly begun, braced for the next blow. "Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel." He tried to laugh away the shift, forcing brightness into the corners of his mouth, as though the moment hadn't slipped from his hands. Shoulders rolled, cuff adjusted, the chair angled back just far enough to look relaxed. But the smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and the room, hundreds of eyes and ears, knew it. Silence pressed against him, so he filled it, because silence had never been his ally. Let's not exaggerate, he said, his voice casual, almost amused. My former partner, bless him, dragged me here over a line item he never understood. If I valued my own time, I'd hire someone to sit in this chair for me, let him have his little theater. Maybe even one of my security guys. He paused, turning his head toward the benches like an actor delivering to the gallery. His finger tracked the back row, slow and deliberate. Actually, look there. I know that face. Worked for Obama, didn't you? Go ahead, tell these fine people whether this is a real court or just a circus with a microphone. The reaction was immediate. Some people laughed nervously, more at the audacity than the joke. Heads swiveled toward a broad-shouldered man in a navy blazer near the rear wall. Phones shifted, lifted just a little higher on laps, cameras ready though no one dared lift them openly under the bailiff's sharp gaze. The man in the blazer looked stunned for half a second, then irritated, then very still. He raised both hands in the small, universal signal. I am not part of this. The whispers ignored him anyway. Secret Service? He said. Obama? What is he doing here? The plaintiff sat rigid at his table. He wasn't polished like his former partner, his suit a little worn at the elbows, the cut 5 years out of fashion. But his posture was exact, back straight, hands folded tight on the table. His jaw looked clenched enough to ache. When he finally spoke, his words were stripped of decoration. We had a contract, he said. His eyes didn't leave her. 3 milestones, 3 payments. I delivered. He paid the first, delayed the second, and promised the third when the optics were right. That was last spring. He hasn't paid it. The room tilted slightly, the balance between the two men shifting. The defendant snorted loudly, a sound designed to belittle. He leaves out the part where his work was sloppy. I fixed it myself. I covered costs he ignored. This isn't debt, it's babysitting. And frankly, it's pocket change. He's chasing pennies while I run a portfolio. She didn't react. She let the noise of his words fade on its own, like smoke dissipating. The plaintiff's eyes remained steady on her, his silence sharper than his statement. The gallery shifted, restless, sensing a new contour forming in the fight. The defendant leaned forward now, elbows planted, voice lowered just enough to sound confidential while still filling the room. You want to know the truth? He wanted the lights. He wanted to sit here and play the victim. He thinks if he says it on television, he'll turn failure into sympathy. He smirked, but it looked stretched now, unnatural. This isn't justice. It's a fairy tale for people who've never read a spreadsheet. Ripples stirred through the benches, skepticism, laughter, whispers, disbelief. The man in the navy blazer stared hard at the exit sign, refusing the part written for him. A woman near the aisle tapped a pen open and shut, until even that sound drew glares. Her gaze lifted slowly from the file in front of her. The pen stopped. Her eyes locked on him, narrowing slightly. So you're saying you brought a presidential bodyguard here? She said, voice steady. To impress this room. She didn't blink. Let me tell you something in return. I don't need the Secret Service to recognize a lie. The line froze the room. The scattered laughter evaporated. A few people shifted uncomfortably on the benches, as if chairs had grown suddenly too small. The defendant's grin faltered for half a breath before he forced it back. That's not what I meant, he said quickly, palms turned outward in mock surrender. I said this isn't a federal proceeding. Which it isn't. That's all. Correct, she replied crisp. It's simpler. We use shorter words here. O is one of them. This time the laughter was real, though it came quickly strangled. Shoulders shook, a cough disguised a chuckle, and then quiet rushed back in. The plaintiff finally separated his hands, palms flat on the table as though bracing himself against the swell. It wasn't victory yet, but it was air after too long underwater. The defendant's instinct was pressure. He leaned in, voice sharp again. I operate at a level where we don't even come down here for these petty disagreements. But fine. I'll be generous. I'll admit an internal delay. That's not a debt. That's timing. Timing, she repeated, tasting the word like she might test counterfeit currency. She flipped one page, then another, her expression unchanged, but the room felt the weight of it. Phones slipped back into pockets. Shoulders leaned forward. Breath slowed. This wasn't television banter anymore. This was arithmetic, and arithmetic was merciless. The plaintiff spoke softly, almost as if apologizing for interrupting. There are emails, he said. I submitted them. And vendor logs. He approved the milestone. He closed the ticket. Then he told me he'd stage the release and move it to summer. But summer passed. The defendant laughed again, hollow now. Context. You'll forgive me if my company manages more than one line item. My staff cleaned his mistakes. We kept vendors happy. If this were serious, I'd have a guard sitting here for me while I went to lunch. It scraped rather than landed. Someone in the second row whispered, He still thinks it's about him, earning a quick nudge to hush. She closed the file and looked directly at him, her eyes unwavering. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was thick, expectant. He adjusted his cuff again, flashing the silver watch as though it might anchor him. It didn't. Her voice cut clean. You seem confident. Confidence is free. Numbers aren't. The gallery reacted as one body, leaning forward, breath held, watching her lift a folder from the clerk's cart. Tabs marked its edges, paper stacked with the stubborn authority of facts. The plaintiff drew in a long breath, preparing for impact. The defendant went still, lips pressed tight, waiting for a fuse he couldn't stop. When the file hit wood, the sound was louder than a shout. She opened the folder with the same care one might use to unseal a letter from decades past. The sound of paper shifting was louder than it should have been, amplified by the room's stillness. Colored tabs marked sections like flags on a battlefield. Her fingers paused on one page, and she let the weight of silence drag everyone forward before she spoke. Here is the payment schedule, she said calmly. And here. She tapped the page once with her fingertip, the sound sharp as a metronome. Is the ledger. It does not match your story. You testified that the debt was cleared last spring. This document shows otherwise. August. Balance unpaid. It was too clean, too precise, and the room knew it. A ripple of whispers spread from the back row forward. Someone muttered, August? With disbelief. Another answered, He's caught, before clamping a hand over their mouth. The defendant's laugh came too quickly, too loud. That's a stale copy, he said, waving his hand as though to swat a fly. Ancient paperwork. I have an updated version. Don't worry about it. He leaned back in his chair, smile reasserted, but the sound of his laugh had cracked at the edges. She did not move, did not smile, did not blink. She simply closed the folder, set it neatly on the desk, and folded her hands. The pause stretched long enough that people began to feel the silence in their chests. Then she said, with the precision of a knife sliding between ribs, I expected you to say that. Which is why I went directly to the bank. The words detonated. The room convulsed in noise, gasps, laughter, shouts overlapping in an uncontrolled wave. Someone in the second row whispered. She knew, with the awe of someone watching a trap snap shut. Phones reappeared in hands, not even lowered this time until the bailiff barked. No recording! The tension didn't dissipate. It magnified. The defendant froze for the briefest instant before forcing his shoulders back. He managed a smile, but it was strained, the corners of his mouth trembling under the effort. He opened his hands like he was about to clap, then set them flat on the table instead, palms sweating against polished wood. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a low register that made every person in the gallery unconsciously tilt forward to catch it. So explain to us, clearly, why your account registered a transfer on the exact day you swore it was cleared. The quiet that followed wasn't natural. It was charged, as though the entire room had become one living thing holding its breath. The plaintiff sat perfectly still, watching, waiting. A woman in the back row dug her nails into her purse strap. The man in the navy blazer from earlier finally turned his head toward the defendant, eyes narrowing, as if even he wanted to hear what excuse would crawl out. The defendant cleared his throat. Once. Twice. He opened his mouth, but the sound that emerged was thin, cracked. He stopped. Tried again. It was. His voice betrayed him, breaking into a hoarse cough. He grabbed his glass of water, gulped too quickly, some spilling on the table. The audience responded as if they had rehearsed it. Murmurs swelled. Someone laughed outright. Another whispered, "He's red," and indeed his face had flushed, blotched patches spreading across his cheeks and down his neck. He slammed the glass down harder than he intended, water splashing the rim. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, but his voice shook. "You're twisting it. That transfer had nothing to do with him. It was a private matter. None of your business." She held his gaze, the silence between them louder than his protest. "Then you'll have no trouble proving that," she said. Her eyes cut briefly toward the plaintiff, then back to him. "Because right now, all we see is a dead alive and breathing." He tried to laugh again, but the sound came hollow, brittle as glass. His hand went instinctively to his cuff, adjusting it for the third time in 5 minutes, the silver gleam of his watch bright and useless. He looked out at the gallery, hoping to find support, but the faces staring back at him were no longer amused. They were hungry. "Answer the question," she said softly. His mouth opened-closed. No answer came. Only silence and the sound of someone's pen tapping nervously 3 rows back. The moment stretched. He shifted in his seat, shoulders rigid now, smirk gone entirely. He looked not like the man who had walked in grinning but like someone trapped in a spotlight with no script. And the gallery knew it. The air vibrated with the awareness. He had stepped into a corner, and the walls were closing in. The room hadn't yet recovered from the blow she had landed when her gaze drifted past the counsel tables, past the plaintiff, past the defendant, to the far back rows. It was subtle, but the crowd noticed. A wave of movement followed her eyes like iron filings pulled by a magnet. Conversations that had been buzzing only moments earlier died mid-sentence. The silence was instant, raw, expectant. Her voice cut through the stillness, calm and exact. "We've heard your explanations. Now I'd like to hear from the person you yourself placed in this room." Every head turned. The man in the navy suit, square-shouldered, hands clasped loosely in front of him, stood. Not quickly, not sheepishly, but with the unhurried confidence of someone long used to attention and suspicion both. He moved down the aisle, steps measured, shoulders straight, carrying himself the way a man does when his job for years has been to notice everything without being noticed himself. Phones dipped lower in laps, tilted upward just enough to catch the shape of him. People leaned to see better, breaths shallow. The gallery had seen his face earlier, but now there was context, and context turned a figure into a presence. He reached the well, raised his hand, and repeated the oath without hesitation. His voice was steady, low, practiced from years of briefings where words mattered more than volume. Then he sat, folding his hands in his lap, eyes fixed on her. "State your name and your prior assignment," she said. He gave both. A ripple ran through the gallery, confirmation, a current of disbelief that became awe. Someone whispered, "Secret Service," and the word traveled like an echo bouncing between walls. She nodded once. "Tell us what you observed." He drew a breath, deliberate, like he'd been rehearsing this moment in silence for months. "I worked protective detail under President Obama," he said. "And afterward, in private security, I encountered Mr. Langford at multiple events. I personally witnessed him bragging about avoiding payment on his contract with the plaintiff. He said, and I quote, 'Money keeps me untouchable. I can delay anyone, and by the time they figure it out, I'll already be on to the next.'" Gasps spread like wine through tall grass. The sound wasn't uniform. Some people laughed sharply, others hissed, but together it created a rolling, uneven noise that filled the room. The plaintiff's shoulders sank for the first time, as though the weight pressing on his chest had lightened by a fraction. The defendant's face flushed crimson, a blotchy red that crept up his neck. He sprang to his feet, chair legs screeching against the polished floor. His voice cracked with fury. "That's a lie. You're bought. You're nothing. Fuck you." The gallery erupted. People shouted, some clapping, some laughing in disbelief. A woman near the aisle blurted, "Oh my God!" while another muttered, "He just lost it." The bailiff lunged forward a step, his voice booming, "Order in the court." The warning cracked like a whip, forcing the sound down, but it didn't erase the energy. The witness didn't flinch. He didn't blink. His posture remained steady, the very definition of composure. "You were proud of it," he said evenly. "That's why I remember. I don't care about your money. I care about accountability." The defendant pointed at him, hands shaking with rage. He tried to string together another insult, but the words tangled in his throat and died there. The silence that followed was worse than his shouting. She hadn't moved through the outburst. Only now did she lean slightly forward, her voice calm, cold, absolute. "And now we see what remains of your dignity once the truth is spoken aloud." The room froze around her words. They didn't echo, they anchored. The defendant slumped back into his chair, jaw tight, his watch flashing in the fluorescent light like a beacon mocking him. He shoved his trembling hands under the table as if to hide them, but the gesture was clumsy, transparent. The gallery absorbed the silence and transformed it. Some leaned back, satisfied. Others leaned forward, wanting more. But all of them knew the performance was collapsing. The man who strutted in with arrogance had been stripped of it, piece by piece, in front of strangers who now owned the memory of his unraveling. Dust drifted in a thin shaft of light from the high windows, glowing briefly before vanishing into shadow. Outside, rain had left the air smelling of wet concrete, and a faint draft carried it in through the rear door. It curled along the floor, cool against ankles, a reminder of the world beyond the trial. She turned back to the witness. "You understood the gravity of what you heard?" He nodded. "I understood the moral weight. The legal interpretation belongs to you." A murmur swept the gallery again, approval, disbelief, a kind of collective awe. He stood, gave a curt nod, and walked back to his seat at the rear. Every eye followed him until he blended back into the crowd, just another face. When he sat, the silence was heavier than before, pressing down like a physical weight. The defendant stared at the tabletop as if it might crack open and swallow him whole. The plaintiff, meanwhile, exhaled through his nose, long and quiet, shoulders easing for the first time since the hearing began. She rested her hand on the next folder on the clerk's cart, her fingers on the metal clasp. The sound of it clicking open was small but felt enormous, a prelude to something worse than testimony, something in writing. The defendant's eyes darted toward her hand, then the exit, then back again. His lips moved, as if rehearsing excuses that would not come. The gallery leaned forward as one, anticipation thick as static before a storm. She lifted the first page, the corner of an email header catching the light. "Since you invited witnesses," she said quietly, "let's also hear what you wrote yourself." The room held its breath. The paper trembled faintly in her hand, not from weakness but from the tension of the moment. And for the first time, the defendant didn't touch his watch, didn't adjust his cuff, he simply stared, frozen, as though the words on that page were already burning through the armor he no longer had. The folder sat beneath her palm, plain and heavy, as though it carried more weight than any words spoken so far. The gallery leaned forward in unison, a ripple of movement that made the benches creak. No one coughed, no one whispered. It was the kind of stillness that made even paper dangerous. She opened the clasp with a metallic snap. The sound traveled the room like a spark across a wire. "For the record," she said evenly, "these are messages originating from the defendant's personal account. Obtained lawfully. Preserved with chain of custody intact." The defendant's mouth twitched into a smile that looked borrowed. He shook his head quickly, a gesture too practiced to convince anyone. She lifted the first page and read without emphasis, her tone stripped to bone. From M. Langford. Subject: litigation strategy. Quote, I can drag them through court for years. Money lets me win even when I owe. They'll run out long before I do. End quote. The gallery exploded. Gasps collided with laughter. Someone clapped, then several more joined before the bailiff's bark of "Order!" snapped the noise down a notch. A man in the second row whispered, "Odd. He wrote that." Phones glowed in laps, tilted just enough to capture memory if not footage. The plaintiff's shoulders sank, his jaw trembling with relief and fury in equal measure. The defendant sprang up, hands pressed flat to the table. "Forgery!" he shouted, his voice pitched higher than before. "Anyone can mock up an email. You think I'd write that?" His throat seized, the last word rasping into a cough. She turned calmly to another tabbed page. From M. Langford. To private counsel. Quote, the plaintiff is desperate. Delay him. Call it an advance, shift recognition, make him chase me. By the time he figures it out, the trail will be gone. End quote. This time the gallery's sound rolled rather than burst. Low laughter, murmurs of disbelief, muttered exclamations. Someone whispered, "He buried himself." Another hissed, "That's the nail." A brief flutter of applause rose before the bailiff's glare pinned it down. The defendant jabbed his finger toward her, then the gallery, shaking with rage. "This is a sham. You can't prove authenticity. You're staging a show." His words cracked, the polish gone, leaving only panic dressed as defiance. She looked up at him, her tone surgical. "These emails were authenticated by your provider and verified through sworn testimony. They are yours, Mr. Langford. Your words, not ours." Silence followed like a blade pressed flat. He slumped back, then jerked upright again, unable to choose between collapse and combat. He swept the papers before him onto the floor, pages scattering in an arc across the polished wood. They slid under benches and toward the bailiff's boots. He tried again, but the sound that left his throat was broken. Fake lies. It carried no force. His eyes darted across the gallery, searching for sympathy and finding only curiosity sharpened into judgment. She let the quiet swell before she spoke. "You haven't just lost a contract," she said. "You've lost your mask." The room responded instantly. Cheers and laughter, restrained but unstoppable, surged up through the benches. Strangers looked at each other with raised brows, shaking their heads in disbelief. The plaintiff exhaled deeply, hands spread flat on the table as though bracing himself against a new kind of weight, vindication. The defendant dropped into his chair. His watch caught the fluorescent glare, its ticking grotesquely loud against the silence. His hands trembled openly now, unable to hide. She stacked the pages neatly, returned them to the folder, and closed the clasp with a soft click. "Let the record show," she said, "that these communications were confirmed and entered as authenticated evidence. Counsel will receive copies at the close." He opened his mouth again, but what came out was a whisper. "No." It barely carried. No one missed it. Outside the windows, pale lights stretched long shadows across the floor. Dust glimmered in the beams, suspended like the moment itself. The air smelled faintly of wet concrete from the storm outside, cold and metallic against the heat of the packed room. She fixed her eyes on him one last time. "You've been undone," she said softly. "Not by me, not by your partner, by yourself." His shoulders sagged, his head bowed. The gallery leaned in, sensing the finish like blood in the water. The man who entered with a grin sat now in silence, trapped inside his own words. The energy in the room had shifted entirely. It no longer felt like a courtroom. It felt like a ring after the bell, when one fighter has already been left staggering and everyone else knows the match is over. The audience leaned back, restless but satisfied, their murmurs humming under the fluorescent lights. The bailiff stood with arms folded, ready for one more outburst that never came. She gathered the documents slowly, not as ritual but as precision, sheets stacked, corners aligned, the folder pressed flat against the desk. Each motion drew the crowd's attention, as though even the sound of paper being squared was part of the verdict. When the last page was in place, the room went silent. Her voice came low, sharp, every syllable deliberate. "Based on the testimony and the evidence before me, I find in favor of the plaintiff. Mr. Langford, you will pay your former partner the full balance of $150,000, plus all costs associated with this action." The reaction erupted like a dam giving way. Applause cracked through the air, sharp and sudden. People whistled, shouted, clapped until the bailiff barked, "Order!" But the command lacked conviction. It was clear the gallery was no longer under discipline. They were celebrating. The sound carried the relief of vindication, of spectacle turning into justice. At the defense table, Langford did not move. His body sagged into the chair, pale as chalk, his lips pressed together until the color drained out of them. His hands rested on the table, trembling openly. The gold watch gleamed, obscene now, a relic of a confidence that had collapsed. He looked smaller, diminished, like the walls themselves had closed in around him. She leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk. Her eyes locked onto his, pinning him in place. The crowd hushed again, sensing something heavier was still to come. "You lived in a world where money meant power," she said. The words fell one by one, a hammer against stone. "In this courtroom, money is only evidence. And today, that evidence convicted you." He blinked once, a tiny, broken gesture. For the first time since he entered, he had no smile, no quip, no shrug. Only silence. "You thought wealth could shield you," she continued. "But all it bought was time. Time ran out. And here, stripped of it, you are no more than what you did." The gallery held its breath, the sound of her words sinking into the grain of the benches and the memory of every person who would leave this room with the story. People would tell it later, the man who thought himself untouchable, cornered at last by his own arrogance. Her hand reached for the gavel. She raised it slowly, deliberately, giving the moment room to expand, to etch itself into everyone's mind. Langford lifted his head a fraction, as if to protest, but the words died before they found air. The gavel came down hard. A single crack, echoing off wood and glass, filling every corner of the chamber. The sound left a hollow stillness in its wake, a silence so complete it was deafening. In that silence, the man who once boasted of buying his way through life sat reduced to nothing more than a figure slumped in a chair, eyes down, hands shaking. The gallery saw it, and the image would stay with them far longer than the applause. Justice didn't roar. It whispered. And that whisper left him smaller than he had ever imagined himself to be.